There we go. So if that works, then we should start to
Excellent.
see participants. Yeah, there we go. There's people. Awesome. I'll just open the chat so that I can see that as well. And while we're waiting for a few people to come and join us, I'm Sarah from For Writing Aid. So thank you for joining us today. I already see someone in the chat who I saw in the previous session, so that's great. But if you can see and hear me, please drop your name and location in the chat. We'd love to know where you're calling from today. So we got Edwin from California, Tony from Canada. Wow, the chat has completely taken off now. I saw someone from Nebraska, Ryan from Nebraska. There we go. It's usually a little bit of a delay, and then all of a sudden everybody rushes in. So that's all sounding good. Let me start off with some housekeeping items. So first, you can access your Horror Writers Fest replays by going to the hub page. You can find the replays along with other session materials posted within the session listings. The time it takes for this can vary due to processing times with Zoom and YouTube, but they will be added as soon as possible. We usually try to do it on the same day, but worst case scenario will be tomorrow probably. They will also be posted to our community page for all members to view by November 1st. All Horror Writers Fest participants will be receiving early access to our upcoming Black Friday sale, which will get you 50% off Premium and Premium Pro plans for both yearly and lifetime. You'll automatically receive an email with more information close to the sale, but if you do not receive anything by November 16th, please reach out to us at hello@prowritingaid.com and we'll be happy to help. And then if you'd like to keep the horror writing conversation going, we'd love to have you in our private online writing community. Joining is easy. You simply click the link below, and I'll drop the links again in the chat just a second. And then you can log in with your Pro Writing Aid account info. You can then hop over to the live event chat or talk to other attendees on our spaces. We'd appreciate it if you could provide your feedback on Horror Writers Fest in the Typeform survey that I will link in the chat, and it's also on the hub as well. We love hosting the events like this, and your feedback plays a pivotal role in our future planning. So you can tell us what you loved, what you think could be improved for next time, and what you'd like to see at a future events. I'm just going to drop the links in the chat. I can see people requesting them, so I'm going to stop myself very quickly to drop these. There you go. Perfect. Okay, right, where was I? There we go. So yeah, if you can just share your feedback, I've dropped that link for you. And then we also have a fun brand new writing challenge coming up called 5K in 5 days, where participants in our community will write 5,000 words or more between November 4th to the 8th. We'll have daily teachings, writing prompts, discussion forums, and even live write-ins that you can take part in. It's going to be a whole thing. It's free to sign up, and we'd love to see you there. The sign-up link should also be in the chat. I will, again, drop it now. There we go. And it's also on the hub. I'm taking part in this, so I'd love to see you guys coming on board and competing in this really friendly competitive challenge. And then some reminders for today. If you have a question for our speaker, please can you use the Q&A box. You should be able to find that button in the center of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to chat with other viewers, please use the chat and be sure to select everyone in the drop-down menu to make them visible to all viewers. Otherwise, your messages will just come to me and Kerry. And I'm sure if you want to talk to other people, you'd probably be better off clicking everyone. So links to your offers and from Pro Writing Aid and our speakers will also be available on the Horror Writers Fest hub. So with that being said, I think we are ready to dive in. Let me just do that and then Alt tab, there we go. Okay, so today we are joined by Kerry Savage. So a voracious reader of all kinds of fiction and sometimes memoir and nonfiction, Kerry Savage, she, her, is an author accelerator certified book coach who works with novelists from the planning stages through revision. She is the co-founder of Shadows and Secrets, the writing retreat for mystery, thriller, and horror authors. Sounds amazing. She's also a J School grad and former project manager, as well as being hard at work on her second novel. She serves as a volunteer mentor for the Women's Fiction Writers Association and Sisters in Crime. She also loves good wine, cheese, and trying to keep her succulents alive. Oh, I know that one. So, thank you for joining us, Kerry.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining me this morning, joining us this morning, especially those of you on the West Coast. I saw a bunch of California folks, and I know it's pretty darn early there, so appreciate you getting up and starting your morning with me. Yes, as Sarah mentioned, hi, I'm Kerry. I am a certified book coach. I'm a writer. I'm a co-founder with Samantha Skull, who I believe you will meet tomorrow. Please be sure not to miss her presentation. It's fantastic. Of Shadows and Secrets, which is the writing retreat for mystery, thriller, and horror authors. I didn't have it in here, but we just had our inaugural retreat, and we did have 2 horror writers, and it was amazing. So horror writers very much welcome at Shadows. And I'm a recovering project manager, so I like all my systems and things and just trying to figure out ways to make this whole writing thing go a little bit easier for all of us. But today we are here to talk about inciting incidents, the thing that gets us all started, right? So more specifically, what I'm going to be talking about today are first, we're going to look at sort of the anatomy of an inciting incident. So we're going to sort of break down the elements of what goes into it, give you a little bit of a checklist sort of mentally and physically, actually. We're going to talk about creating tension and stakes in the inciting incident. We're going to connect the inciting incident to your subgenre. Just like every genre of fiction, horror has some subgenres, and there are going to be some boxes that you want to be sure that you're ticking with your inciting incident and throughout your entire manuscript too. So you want to be sure that you're being mindful of that, and I will certainly talk more about that when we get there. And then ultimately, we're going to talk about escalating the horror. So I'm going to stray a little bit from the inciting incident in talking about that, but always connecting it back to how you've kicked us off on this journey that you're taking us on, this horror journey. So my goal for you all today is to understand how to craft an inciting incident that is going to hook your reader, that's going to meet all of the genre expectations, perhaps play with those genre expectations, but definitely be present there so they're not disappointed or throwing your book across the room. And making sure that you're setting up the horror that you're about to inflict on your lovely readers. Just a note too that we are going to be doing a few writing exercises, so be sure that you have something to write on. You have a paper and pen, or you have access to your work in progress. Or I know that the link to the workbook that I've sharing with y'all that is totally free, which has a breakdown of how to craft an inciting incident in it, as well as a lot of the information that I'm going to be going over today. That link has been thrown in the chat, so you can go ahead and feel free to download that if you want to work in that. But a paper and pen will do you just fine too. So with all of that introduction, let's get into the meat of the thing. So what actually is an inciting incident, right? An inciting incident is an event that occurs at or near the start of the story, usually at or near the start of the story, that sets the main character on the journey of the story, right? It's that point of no return. It's this thing that happens that they react to, and it forces some choices upon them that even if they don't realize it at the time, and they probably don't ever realize it at the time, they're not going to be able to go back from. They're not going to be able to return to the status quo of the life that they have had before this thing happens to them. And I want to talk a little bit about what the timing of that looks like, right? Because when we meet people, when we open up a book and we're starting to read, they've had a whole life off page, off screen, that we as readers know nothing about. As writers, we should know some things about what that status quo looks like, even if all of that information doesn't make it to the page, and it often doesn't, and that's fine. But we need to understand a lot about that status quo because we that are then going to disrupt it, and we can't manipulate that disruption the way we need to if we don't understand what that disruption is, why it is a disruption, what it means to our protagonist that we've just put them into, right? So the book starts, something happens that they can't come back from. The trend for that is for that to happen sort of ASAP, right? Especially in mystery thriller and sort of horror as tucked into that whole group. I think the trend that you'll and the recommendation that you'll hear from a lot of people is like, as soon as you possibly can make that happen, you should. And I'm not here to disagree with that per se, but I do want to push back on it just a little bit because of that status quo thing that I've been emphasizing a little bit. If we're dropped into the middle of a situation where all hell is breaking loose, like as an action movie or an action adventure kind of thing, that's great. But the thing about a lack of context is that we don't have any way of making meaning of it, right? So I am a big fan of just like giving people some contextual information, giving your reader some contextual information so that they can understand what it is that is happening in terms of the character's life, so that we know, oh, okay, like they were just kind of tootling along and now this thing happens and like, oh crap, now I can't go back. Well, why? Why is it important? What does it mean to them? They may not entirely know what it means yet, right? That's what's going to happen in the unfolding of the whole book, but we need to have some sense as writers of like what all of that is. Very rarely the inciting incident can happen off screen before the story starts. A great example of this, it's not horror, but it's just such a great example that you just see it used everywhere, or at least I have in all of my writing classes in life, is Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. The opening lines of that book are literally, Lydia is dead, but they don't know this yet. And so Lydia's death is the inciting incident of the book. It has happened off screen before the book's opening pages. And what we see in the first chapters is them realizing that she's missing and everything that starts to fall apart because of that missingness. So it can happen off page, but then you are doing a little bit of work, not backwards, but more establishing work then along the way to be like, oh, okay, well, again, making meaning of it. What does that mean that it's happened? So I am a fan of giving readers a little bit of context before you dive in. It's not the only way to do it, obviously, as we've just discussed. And I think the flip side of that is that sometimes we as writers tend to do a lot of throat clearing, right? We write our way into our books. And so we may have a place that we think we have an inciting incident, but actually our inciting incident is happening on page 45 or page 80. And when that happens, you want to be sure that like, okay, all that chunk of writing, if this is important contextual information, it probably shouldn't come here. It's probably not the right place for that information. I can feed that in as backstory somewhere else. And also probably a lot of it you don't actually need. You needed it as the writer to write your way into the story, but the reader doesn't need it in order for all of that maximum impact. That meaning can be doled out later or just cut. So what are some key elements of an effective inciting incident? You can tell I already got a little bit tired of typing inciting incident over and over again. So you'll see that throughout. That's what that means. So the key element is that no matter what happens, there is a disruption of the ordinary world of the protagonist, right? They're coming along, they're doing their thing, and then something happens that is just gonna like turn the world upside down for them, right? It introduces danger or a threat. And that danger or threat can be psychological, supernatural, or physical, or a combination of all of those, depending on where your book is going and what kind of book you're writing. I would also argue that if there's any kind of threat or danger, there's always a psychological element to it because something is going to be messing with your protagonist, right? Something is going to be in their heads. They're not going to know maybe fully what meaning to make of it yet, but is someone gaslighting them? Are they doubting themselves? Are they paranoid? Like there's all kinds of juicy stuff that's going to start going on in terms of their interiority and their psychological fitness or lack thereof. So you can start playing with that immediately. And speaking of immediate, this, as I keep emphasizing, whatever it is that happens, it has an immediate impact on their life. They cannot go back. They cannot ignore it. I think I say this elsewhere in the presentation. This is the type of event that like it can't have been an email. It had to be a meeting, right? It's not something that can be resolved with a phone call. or a conversation or something like that. It has to force them into action, even though they're not going to necessarily realize the full impact. As I mentioned, that's something that's probably going to spool itself out over the course of the entire novel, but it can't let them go back, right? Um, it's also ideally going to point to the story outcome. So your reader isn't going to necessarily see this when they're reading the inciting incident. They're just excited about what's happening and the adventure that you're launching them into, or the horror that you're about to take them through. But when they get to the end, an astute reader can and will look back on the course of the book and say, oh yeah, I see what they did there with that inciting incident. They were pointing me there this whole time, and I didn't know it at the time because like it's not supposed to be obvious. But it does sort of nudge you towards the outcome. You're actually, even when you're writing it and doing discovery writing as a process, setting this up, you're pointing yourself towards an outcome, even if you don't quite realize it yet. So let's talk a little bit specifically about inciting incidents in horror. There are certain expectations that you want to try to meet, and that by meeting those, I don't mean that you have to like just align with every single trope very neatly. You can absolutely play with expectations. You can have fun. You can turn them on their head. But you have to know what they are. It's the same thing as any rule in writing, right? You have to know what it is before you play with subverting it or twisting it or doing your own, sort of putting your own spin on it. So some specific expectations for the horror genre are that emotional intensity, right? We read horror to be scared. We know what we're getting ourselves into when we pick up a Stephen King novel, right? We know there's going to be some really scary stuff that's going to happen, and we're here for it. That's why we picked up the book, right? So there needs to be that fear. There needs to be dread. There's questions about survival, and also things that might be worse than survival. Maybe in the end, death is going to be or would be a welcome thing because everything is just so freaking bad and you don't know how to get out of it. We want there to be tension in the atmosphere almost immediately, right? You can use some foreshadowing. You can use this to drop hints about what's to come, like pointing towards like, here's where I'm going to be taking you. Really lean on tone and setting elements. They do a lot of work in this genre. And I was thinking about this as I was sort of gearing up for this presentation, and I reread the beginning of The Dark Half by Stephen King just to sort of get me in the mood. And he does this in a really interesting way. In the first part of this book is actually the inciting incident is that he knocks off his protagonist is a writer who has just killed the protagonist of his best-selling series, right? And there's this obituary in People magazine that shows him like at the grave of George Stark, who is his protagonist. And the atmosphere is actually quite like lovely because he's with his wife, he's with his babies that he's just twin babies that they've just had. They're making jokes. It's very lighthearted. And you think like, oh, okay, this sunny moment, it's not what you would expect, right? You expect sort of doom and gloom right off the bat. But what happens in this sunny moment that he's provided us, this sort of lovely family tableau, is that we know the clock is ticking because we didn't pick up a nice contemporary romance or anything like that. We know everything is going to go to hell very soon. So that even heightens, that creates tension by setting us up to know like, here's this lovely situation. It's all going to fall apart. Oh my gosh, he's got a wife. He's got these two babies. Bad things are going to happen. What are they? Oh my God, this is not going to be good, right? So that's a way of twisting that expectation of like, we're starting up here and everything is wonderful. And then how is it going to fall off the cliff? Because we know that it is. And escalation. So we know just by default, because it's what's kicking us off. This is just the start. Things are going to snowball and they are going to get so much worse. It's going to multiply. It's going to get way more insidious. It's going to just get way more painful. So those are the kinds of things that readers expect going into it. And those are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about as you're crafting this, right? So how exactly do you create those tension and those stakes? As I mentioned, you want to use tone and atmosphere. So using setting and sensory details to create unease. And as I just mentioned, You can do that by setting up a perfectly sunny day where there's a picnic in the park and everything is wonderful. You can also do that by going a slightly more expected route. It doesn't make it any less effective, right? I think sometimes people go, "Oh, well, it's a trope, and I don't want to use it, or I don't want to do that, like that stepping on a branch in the woods, creating that cracking noise." But everybody's scared of that, or most of us are. Many of us are. I probably shouldn't say everybody because there are people out there who we all have different fears. Um, but those are classics for a reason, and you can employ them to good use in creating these tension and stakes. Like again, your audience knows what it's getting itself into. So the key thing is that you're deliberately taking those elements and turning them up as much as you possibly can and squeezing all the juice out of them, right? So think about setting and sensory details, because especially around things I think like smell and taste, those are ones that we don't often see. And yes, you want to use them judiciously. But we see and hear by default on the page, right? We don't necessarily smell or taste or even necessarily touch things by default. So any way that you can use those kinds of sensory details to create unease or set up something that, like, I know I'm making it super comfortable now because it's about to get really, really uncomfortable, that's fantastic. You also obviously, referencing the cracking of the wood in the forest, someone stepping out in the, like, not in your sight line. You want to leverage the unknown to evoke fear, right? So our brains are geared to are set to make meaning of things. So if we can't see things, but we hear a noise, we don't know what it is, so we can't associate that, like, oh, I heard the branch cracking. It was a branch falling from a tree. That's all it was. No. I'm immediately, because I'm scared of the woods in the dark, like a sane person, I'm immediately going to think, oh no, there's someone coming through the woods to come and get me. So use that innate ability of our brains to want to make meaning, to want to do pattern recognition, to want to assign things, and create the tension and the fear around that using, like, oh, well, you think it's this, but it actually isn't, or, those kind of jump scare moments. The stakes for our protagonist. So think about what is at risk for the main character, right? Are they going to lose a relationship? Are they going to lose a loved one? What's motivating them? Are they losing their minds? Are they really losing their minds, or is someone trying to manipulate them to think that they are losing their minds? Their physical safety, up to and including death, is always a classic for a reason. And as I mentioned before, is there a fate that they would consider worse than death? There's, I can think of a couple of books now where the protagonist, actually sort of wanted to die for whatever reason. They were in a really bad place mentally, and then realized that pulling through for some other reason, it wasn't even necessarily for them. It was like, in one case, this person wanted to save their dog, which, you've got me every time, like, don't hurt the dog. People, anything can happen to the people, but don't hurt the dogs. That they're going to put themselves at risk to save the dog. They don't really care what happens to them, right? But they're motivated by something outside themselves. And then how does that threat escalate into something the protagonist can't ignore, right? That is the key thing, as I keep saying over and over again, because it is the crucial thing. It can't be a phone call. It can't get resolved with a conversation. It has to launch them on a journey of discovery and distress in this particular case, that is going to just basically put them through hell for the next 250 to 300 pages. Think about how they're going to react to this thing, right? That immediately they're probably going to be scared. They're probably going to be confused. There might be a healthy dose of denial involved there. The longer term things that you can play with is, like, is there fight or flight going on? What does their survival instinct look like? How does that kick in? And what actions do they take because of these reactions? All right, so we have come to the moment of our first exercise. So we're going to either craft a new inciting incident. We're going to take 5 minutes and we're going to brainstorm and do a little bit of writing about an inciting incident for a new story, or if you have a work in progress that you're dealing with, you can, by all means, pull that up and sort of put what you have on the page sort of through its paces, through the ringer, so to speak. think about what the incident entails, think about what the threat or the disruption is, what's at risk for the protagonist, why can't they just ignore it, why can't they pick up the phone and get someone to come over and help them and make it go away, what their reactions are. Again, leaning on all of those five senses. What are they feeling? What are they seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling? If they're alone, what are they thinking? Get in their heads and make us see all the things that they're going through, all the questions that they're asking of themselves. If there was somebody else or a group of others, what are those people saying to each other? Are they questioning things? Is someone trying to calm everybody down? Is somebody else trying to escalate things? Is anybody gaslighting anybody else? All of these things, you can think about these dynamics. And then the final question, which I think is maybe the hardest one, to be honest, how does the inciting incident point towards the resolution of your story? And you don't need to know that. It's totally fine, especially if you're just starting out and crafting. I'd rather you focus on the stuff up at the top and just get some juicy ideas down on the page. But if you do know what your inciting incident is, but you are not sure about how it points to the resolution of your story, like that's totally cool. I think this is a great opportunity to brainstorm some possible outcomes, because there may be a few different ways that you can take it. And then once you sort of game them out a little bit, you will realize like, oh yes, this is the juicy one. This is the one that I want. This is going to allow me to have the most fun with my poor protagonist and really put them through the ringer. So I'm going to stop talking right now. I'm going to put 5 minutes on my timer and I will go off camera so I'm not staring into the void. I will give you a 1 minute warning when we're just about up, and then we'll come back and do some more. All right, have fun. Okay, we've got about 1 minute. Okay. Give everybody a couple of minutes to, or not a couple of minutes, just a few seconds to wrap up. I hope that was fun, especially if you were crafting something new, or even if you weren't, if you were working on something that you already had, and maybe if it gave you a new fun detail to add, or you just, twisted the knife, so to speak, a little bit more. Um, oh, good. I'm just looking. I see, very helpful. I love that. Very, very glad to hear it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about connecting to subgenre. So, if you haven't thought about exactly what subgenre you're working in, I think now is a perfect time to think a little bit about what exactly, where exactly, what pond you're playing in. And the reason that this is important, I mean, knowing that you're writing horror is a great start because, there are specific expectations that come along with that, that you're probably aware of if you're writing horror. Identifying your subgenre can help you even further identify some of those audience expectations. It's also really helpful when you are getting ready to query or publish, because you'll know sort of who you want to target in terms of agents and or editors, and if you're self-publishing, knowing which of those buckets in which to put your work can really help with finding it. But that's taking a step ahead a little bit. Let's take a step back and say, so I've listed here just some of the subgenres in the overarching horror category. You can always just Google like horror subgenre. It'll give you a whole list, or multiple lists, honestly, so you can kind of sort through and see what the commonalities are. And some of them are geared more towards screenplays than novels, but I think that they can still be useful. There's definitely a lot of shared DNA between those things. But just some of them: psychological, supernatural, paranormal, gothic, dark fantasy, apocalyptic slasher, body, comedy, etc. As I said, there's a whole bunch. And some of those subgenres have different expectations. Shocking, I'm sure, because it's just like genre, right? So for example, if you say that you're writing a supernatural horror, make sure that there's something otherworldly. And this is, when I say make sure there's something otherworldly, obviously you need that in your novel, but I would say make sure it's in your inciting incident, or you're giving a hint of what is to come right up front. If you start whipping out the ghosts at like 60% of the way through, I think people are probably going to be confused. I can actually think of a very prolific writer, very famous writer who I will not name because I have not actually read the book, but a friend complained to me about, like, yeah, all of a sudden I was 70% of the way through the book and there was a ghost all of a sudden. Like, where the hell did that come from? And she felt cheated and did not appreciate it at all. There are other instances I can think of too where it does work, but those people again are probably 15, 20 books in. I would not recommend doing this, especially when you're just starting out. The rules are there for a reason to a certain extent, and I am a rule breaker, not a rule follower myself. But you need to know them in order to be able to break them effectively, and that's the key thing. You can break whatever rule you want. So when I'm saying put that supernatural something right up front, please do. But if you don't, make sure that there's a good reason that you're not doing it. Make sure it's connected to like the best twist you've ever written. And it's not the kind of twist that's a writer's gonna be like, that's not a twist. They're just cheating because they didn't have a better way to explain this thing that happened other than like it was a ghost or if it was an evil twin. Try to stay away from evil twins too. It's just kind of been overdone. But you could write the best evil twin ever, and then that would be amazing. So yeah, break all the rules if you want to. Sorry, gotten off track. So supernatural, make sure that there's something otherworldly that happens. I say the sooner the better, but if you don't, just know that there should be a good reason for it. Psychological stuff. I mean, so much of the horror genre and thriller and all of that stuff comes back to psychology. Like, does the protagonist doubt themselves? Does someone else gaslight them? What are they paranoid? How can you add, as the author, how can you add something insidious to an event that might feel mundane on its face? So maybe it's a little bit ho-hum, but there's some detail or something that is hinting at that signals to the reader, hey, yeah, this person has no clue, but I'm telling you because you're an astute reader and you're paying attention, like, yeah, get a load of this. Look, this is what they have coming to them. It's not the easiest thing to do, but we also, as readers, are cued immediately because of genre and subgenre expectations to be looking for certain things. So we will make meaning out of those details where we tend to be pretty smart readers. Not always. And if someone's going to quibble with you about certain silly things, then I will say, no, that's not so smart. But we will make meaning of stuff. So if you're putting details in there, we expect that you're doing that with a reason and we're going to make meaning of them. So take advantage of that where you can. Circling back to subgenre expectations, like with body horror, start your physical change in the inciting incident, right? Hint, or at least hint towards that. The start of that physical change or the contamination that is going to escalate. Thinking back to the dark half, it's not entirely in the inciting incident, it's actually in the prologue, but he gives us a bit of that body horror in the prologue, which is like, very closely connected to the inciting incident where, and this is not a spoiler because it's in the first 10 pages of the book, our protagonist is a teenager, he's had a seizure, he's having brain surgery because they've found a tumor as a result of the seizure. And his tumor is actually whatever that syndrome is where a twin eats another twin in utero. And what they find in his brain is an eyeball, among other things. There's teeth in there. I think there's a nose or part of a nose too. But he shows like a nurse fainting and the anesthesiologist throws up. And it's really, this eyeball just sitting in the brain blinking. And I mean, if that's not just a perfect little moment, a little horror moment, I don't know what is. But that is the hint that right there of like this thing that they have just found in his brain, this twin that has been subsumed is going to be causing some problems, right? And because we're reading horror, we know that like, oh no, this isn't just there to gross us out or shock us or anything, even though it does all of those things, but like it's pointing towards like, it's the big neon sign of like, this is important. This is what's has everything to do with what's to come. Introducing some other story elements too. So horror obviously doesn't just scare us, right? I mean, it does a really good job of doing that. And that's ultimately why we read it, because we love to be scared and we want to be uncomfortable and icked out and all of those things. But it really reflects some deep fears, some common deep things that we all have going on as humans, those anxieties that we have on both a personal and a societal level. So you can think about what themes are you exploring in your novel? And then of those themes that you're exploring. And I think ideally I would recommend that you pick one overarching one. It's what my mentor Jenny Nash likes to call the golden thread, which sounds very innocuous for horror. But it is this sort of like the thing what gets woven through the entire narrative. But you can certainly have sub-themes. So it doesn't only just ever have to be one thing. And then think about how do those sort of themes get introduced in the inciting incident? And if they're not, how can you plant some seeds? How can you go back and look at like, if the theme is something to do with, oh my gosh, now I'm going to have a hard time coming up with one, that is, I'm just coming to autocracy. So we're not going to go any deeper on exploring that at all. But like, how do you hint at what that horror might look like? How do you hint at that control? How do you hint at that gaslighting in the inciting incident so that you can bring forward those themes? And it's naturally, if you get it in there, if you plant those seeds, then you've actually made your job a little bit easier because those seeds can take root and then start to bear fruit as you work your way through. Oh, I've set this in motion here, at 50%. Now I'm thinking about what's this next thing to happen. You can refer back to your inciting incident and go, oh, well, this was a natural outcome of that. I've introduced this idea. Let's play with that here. Let's see where that's going. So think about what the unknown is. Think about all the fears that come around all of those unknowns. Think about societal concerns and anxieties, and think about personal traumas. And this does not mean that you need to mine your own personal trauma for your work. You can certainly, and a lot of us do in memoir and in fiction as well. You don't have to, but you certainly can. So those are just some things to get you thinking about, like the bigger picture kind of things that are going to bring some universal elements into your very specific story. I also wanted to touch on the antagonist. We're also at the point where I confess, Canva started throwing some really interesting images at me. And when I searched for antagonist, it gave me this cat picture, which I just thought was so funny that I'm going to include it. And there are a couple more delightfully camp photos for you to enjoy coming up because Canva was just having a day, apparently. But specifically talking about the antagonist. So how much, if anything, is revealed about the antagonist in the inciting incident, right? I mean, perhaps in an ideal world, you would introduce them, but maybe they're not known to be the antagonist. Maybe they're just another face in the crowd. Or maybe your antagonist is more of a power or an entity or a thing that hasn't yet been embodied. Maybe they're introduced that way. As to, are they embodied? Are they a person or are they something else? Are they a mysterious force? Depends on what kind of horror you're writing, right? What does your protagonist learn about them? Or what does your protagonist know about them at the start of the inciting incident? Maybe they don't know anything. Maybe your inciting incident is introducing this antagonistic force. Or maybe this antagonist has existed in their status quo, and what's happened is that the antagonist, whether your protagonist knows it or not, your antagonist has come in and been the disruptor, deliberately, not deliberately. Deliberately is frankly more fun. So these are all these possibilities that you can lean on, and then think about, what does your protagonist actually learn during the inciting incident? Do they actually learn anything? Do they think they've learned something and now they're this wiser person, but really what they've done is like, oh no, this beautiful misdirection where they're like making meaning of it, but their meaning is completely wrong. If there's information, where does that misinformation come from? Is it because the antagonist is lying to them, or is the protagonist making assumptions that are wrong, which is then setting up that misdirection and setting up twists that you can pull out later on? So lots of little levers that you can levers you can adjust, dials you can twist to sort of introduce all of this kind of stuff. So talking about escalating the horror, right? So the aftermath of your inciting incident is you're going to take that moment and you're just going to gradually, and maybe not so gradually, sometimes make it worse, right? But think about how the protagonist's worldview has just been shattered by what happened to them. And again, I know I sound like a broken record, but these things are important. So that's why I repeat them a lot. Like, maybe they don't fully understand what has happened to them yet, right? They're thinking like, okay, well, I definitely can't go back. Status quo is over. That's done. But maybe it's not as bad as I think it is, right? Like, I can just maybe, if I make this choice over here, that'll get things back to normal. Of course, as the writer, like, absolutely not. It's going to get so much worse for you. But your protagonist can 100% just be trying to work their way back to status quo and just making every terrible possible bad decision. What kind of things do they want to desperately protect, or what kind of things do they want to avoid? So what kind of decisions are they going to make in order to protect these things or avoid these other things happening? and how can what has happened to them directly attack those fears, those things that they want to protect? How can that make them feel unsafe or make these things precious to them feel unsafe? Think about what you're using to create the terror. Are you using psychological suspense? Are you putting them in physical danger? Are you using supernatural elements? Is there manipulation, gaslighting going on? And how do you continually ratchet up those elements or strategically dial them back, which actually leads me into my next slide, which is about pacing. So there's no right or wrong answer to this. You can have a slow burn. That's completely legitimate, as is like putting your protagonist over and over again into imminent danger. So it just depends on the kind of story that you want to write. But as with everything, I want you to be deliberate with this choice, right? So some kinds of stories are going to thrive on that slow burn where your tension is mounting gradually, where I think like there's definitely a lot of psychological stuff you can do here, right? With the paranoia and misdirection and gaslighting and all of those kinds of things. Other kinds of stories are delivering those immediate threats, sort of one after another. Things are constantly just getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Just think about which type of story you're writing and just be mindful about why you chose that approach. Again, no right or wrong answer here. The right answer is the one that works for the story and for you feeling like, well, I did this, I made this choice, and here's why. As long as you can articulate the choice and then why you chose that approach, I say you're on the right track. And the other thing is just don't forget that even the most tightly paced and plotted thriller, horror, whatever we're looking at here, all of those stories, every story needs a few moments of pause, right? Your protagonist always needs moments to take a beat and process what has happened to them, because as readers, we need those moments too. If there's constant nonstop threat, anxiety, anxiousness that is just constantly getting worse and worse and worse and worse, I mean, ultimately, yes, I have been telling you to do that, and I'm not lying, I promise. But if you don't have those moments where you've dialed it back a little bit and given us a chance to breathe, then it takes the sting out of all of the things that are happening, right? Because we don't have the contrast. It's the contrast that really helps highlight and put the spotlight on how bad things are when there is that moment to step back. If it's constant anything, we just get used to it, right? And so by the end, it's just continual. It's like, oh, well, okay, like, yeah, that was a lot, but okay, fine. Whereas if you have those moments of pause where everything seems like it's okay, and then there's something, terrible happens, we've taken a breath and we're like, oh, okay. And then, oh no, like the impact is that much greater. There can't be any hills without valleys. So couple of pitfalls and no-nos. And then I might skip the last exercise because I want to have plenty of time for questions because I think there were some questions. So just a few things to make sure that you avoid. You don't want an inciting incident that's too small or that suffers from vagueness. As I said, does it pass the phone call or this should have been an email test? Please make sure that the stakes are crystal clear, because if there is no impact on your protagonist, your reader won't care. And they'll just think you're sort of meandering off into nowhere. And that's like, they'll put the book down, and we absolutely don't want them to put the book down until they've hit the very end, right? Don't want them putting the book down at page 10 or 15 or 20. Not following through on the suspense or the threat that you've just set in motion, right? You don't want it to get a chance to dissipate. And that doesn't mean, again, like there's pacing concerns that you want to be thinking about. But even in those valley moments, we still want the protagonist to be aware that there is a threat. We still want them to be thinking about it. We still want them to be processing it. It's just those valley moments are moments of reflection. They can be moments of more considered decision making rather than a snap decision reaction to something that's happening immediately in front of them. And sorry, this is another set of those silly photographs that I found. This one, I think I put in pitfalls or something, and then all of these things came up, and I thought, wow, there's a lot of different ways for people to be warned to not fall off cliffs. So yeah, thought I'd share. And then the final no-no that I want to call out, sorry, ADHD brain, are the stakes not being personal enough, right? Horror hits hardest when it's tapping into a protagonist's deepest fears and personal vulnerabilities, because we as readers relate to those fears and personal vulnerabilities. Even if we don't share them, chances are that you're going to have hit on some universal things that are absolutely, like, even if I don't specifically share your fear of heights or spiders or something, you can make me feel what your protagonist is feeling, and I am going to empathize with them and therefore feel that same dread, horror, fear that they are feeling, even if it's not my particular thing. But that means you have to be evoking that emotion. If the protagonist doesn't care, neither do we as readers. If it's just like, this, all right, I'm gonna go there. Sorry, it's early in the morning still, even here, but like there's a spider crawling up your arm. If the protagonist is just like and just flicks it off, those of us who have a fear of spiders might be a little icked out by that, but it's still not going to register with us the same way as like if that's happening and it's like your protagonist's worst nightmare and they're just going into like, where did it come from? There has to be more, right? Oh, now there's going to be spiders in my bed. All of the irrational things that we spin out on when we confront this kind of stuff. This exercise is just all about escalation and jotting down some more options. Like I said, I'm going to skip it, but it is in that workbook that you have. So all of the content from the slides is all sort of distilled into that workbook and is there. I don't know where my picture went here, but this is just another link to that free workbook. And it's got all the exercises to walk you through and more details. And then here's just some information about me that I'll keep up while we do questions. So there's me and there's shadows too. And if you're interested in shadows, please sign up and go to that website as well.
Thank you so much, Kerry. That was amazing. I really enjoyed the activity that you hosted. I thought that was really cool, and we got a lot of love in the chat for that as well. So
Nice.
that was awesome. I'm also really enjoying everyone talking about the cat. Just as you mentioned it as well, my cat came in. I was like just demanding attention, basically disrupting the meeting. So I've had to shut him up. But like, I was so
He's up
worried.
to something though, don't you think? He's probably up to something.
Exactly.
Just like
Yeah,
that cat.
exactly. Brilliant stuff. Okay, so we have a few questions to get started with. I'm also just going to drop the links in the chat as well while we answer some questions. Okay, so Shelby asked, for a detective novel, would the inciting incident be the first murder, or could it be something more character related, or both?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think in general, my first reaction would be yes, it probably is because in a mystery we want to have a body, if not on the first page, in the first chapter, and that usually is like because the story question behind a mystery is who killed this person and why. Then it is that body dropping that sets that's the world disruptor there. So yes, that doesn't mean to say that you can't have that other element included as well. It's just sort of probably how you've set up who your protagonist is, their relationship, if any, to the murder victim, and what sort of journey you're setting them on, like in terms of what this investigation is going to mean for them. So I think you can have both, but like as a general rule in a mystery, yeah, it's that first body that sets us off because the whole idea behind it is the investigation.
Perfect. Awesome. Okie dokie. And then we've got Adam said, hi Kerry, do you have any examples of inciting incidents that point to the resolution of the story?
Oh my gosh. Not off the top of my head, but I'm writing that down and it's going to be the subject of my next newsletter and blog post. So I don't want to be this like shameless plug for me. I really don't, I promise. But if you want to subscribe and then you can unsubscribe after I answer the question, that's totally fine. No, will not be offended.
Cool.
That's a great question and I should have come prepared and I didn't. But I will get an answer for you. I promise. That points to resolution.
So, Adam, sign up for the newsletter because it sounds like that one's going to be directed specifically. Okie dokie. So then I think it's Trina, I want to say that's how you pronounce it. You know, tell me in the chat if I'm wrong. From the incident, can you skip from moments after to weeks slash months down the line to where it seems like things are quite normal, but then the antagonist returns and shakes it all up, you know, makes it worse?
Yes. In fact, it sounds like I probably, if there's, I would want, I guess I would ask you as a coach, my question to you would be, why do you need that big gap of time? Why can't it just be like the inciting incident happens and then we're into the next thing? Like, but if there's a good story reason for it to be like that, there needs to be this break in time, and you're doing the wise thing as a writer by not like giving us 3 chapters of exposition that we don't care about. I mean, like where your mind is at with thinking like, yes, I'm going to skip ahead several months. If that's the next time that like the action really gets going, yes, absolutely. I think just my question would be why do you have that gap in there? And if there's a good reason for it, great, then you're all set.
Cool. Okie dokie. So Shelby asked another question. So they said about mixing genres, so such as horror, detective work. So obviously this was the person who asked the detective question before. How do you balance between living up to both expectations of providing enough satisfaction of expectations for the horror reader and the mystery reader? That's a really good question.
Ooh, that is a really good question. Well, I think primarily what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to decide for yourself, am I writing a mystery with horror elements or am I writing a horror with mystery elements? And the reason that I think that question is, or that answer to that question is important, is those are going to be sort of the rules, the tropes, the expectations that you're going to make sure that you satisfy. Because if you are, say, like, oh, I'm writing a mystery, but like you, as you were writing, you're leaning into the horror of it, and you leave some mystery questions or some mystery expectations out. The way your book would be marketed and sold is to mystery writers. It's not like they would ignore the horror elements of that. But then you're going to have really upset mystery writers because you didn't answer some fundamental question or you didn't meet a fundamental expectation. Whereas a horror reader isn't necessarily that, like, yeah, they'll be sort of interested in the mystery, I would imagine, but if you skipped some of that mystery stuff, like the horror writer isn't necessarily there for, or the horror reader, I should say, isn't there for that. They're going to be mad if you miss some of the horror expectations. So that's where I would just find, like, it's like, you know, I say with romance and everything, because lots of books have romance as subplots. If you're not writing a romance, you don't need to necessarily hit those romance tropes because your book is not going to be marketed to an audience of romance readers. It's just an element in this other type of book that you are writing. So I think being very, very clear about which primary set of expectations you need to satisfy is the most important way that you want to start.
Perfect. Okay. And then I think it's Maya asked, how would you adapt or change things for children's horror, or wouldn't you?
Oh my gosh. I have to confess, I am not a children. Well, I know nothing. I am childless by choice, so I don't have to satisfy those for little ones in my own life. And I don't know, honestly. That's a great question. I mean, obviously, I think there's a lot of like stuff that's probably off the table, body wise in particular, like just because the gore factor, I would imagine for small children should be ratcheted way down. But I don't have a good answer for that question just because it's so far out of my realm of expertise. The only thing I can add is like I was reading Pet Sematary when I was like 11, which may or may not have been a great idea, but I survived and here I am. So then again, I don't know. So, but children is even younger than that, I would imagine. So I would really look for someone who does specifically specializes in that kind of thing and ask that question there. 'Cause I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you.
No, that's fair. Okay, and then I think we've got time for a couple more. So, Andrew asked if we could elaborate on the how does the incident point towards the resolution? So obviously we asked for examples for it, but like could you elaborate
I
on
can
what that
speak
means?
to it a little. I hope I can. I'm going to try my best. So basically what it is I think, when you've read a book and you're at the ending and they do that thing that they do, which may or may not be super obvious, but it almost always means that you've come full circle. So whatever you've set in motion, right? You've set with the inciting incident, you've set a story question and an emotional sort of character arc question in motion with whatever happens there. And the ending is supposed to be the resolution to that. It's the ending of the journey. So we want to have turned back around and said whatever issues, questions, all the things that have been opened up by the inciting incident have now been resolved. And the caveat that I'm going to throw out there with horror in particular is that is not necessarily actually a genre expectation of horror. We like it, and it's not that you can't wrap things up in a horror novel, but they do have a tendency in cases to leave things more open-ended. So like you don't entirely know, like the story question has been resolved, but you don't entirely know that it's been resolved. So it's not over. It's like, well, the thing could come back. The power still exists. The nightmare is still out there, but what kind of form is it going to take? We don't know. Use your imagination because the book's over. Whereas in mystery, like you need to wrap up that story, that question, right? You know who's killed the victim and why they did it. So that story has been wrapped up neatly. Horror doesn't have quite that same thing, but what I mean by it is that you're opening up possibilities with the inciting incident and that you're closing them in a way that nods back to like, yes, I know I opened these story questions. I know I indicated I was going to write about these issues and this is me resolving them now. Um, like I said, hopefully with some examples that will become a little bit more clear. It is a bit of an abstract concept. I
No,
know.
that's fair. Well, it just means that we've all got to sign up for your your
That's
newsletter.
right. Like I said, you can unsubscribe after I answer it. No, I won't be offended.
No, cool. Awesome. Okay. I think that's probably all we have time for today. And we did have a few questions left over. Kerry, do you have anywhere that people could drop like a line, just ask questions to you
Yeah,
directly?
so my email address, Kerry@kerrysavage.com. Please feel free to email me there. Or if you do sign up for my list, you can always just reply to one of my newsletters, and that goes straight into my inbox as well. So please send me questions. I would love to answer them.
Perfect stuff. Awesome. All right, there you go, guys. So sorry if we didn't get to your question, but you can always email Kerry directly.
Yes.
So thank you guys for joining us. This has been amazing. I've been learning quite a lot myself, and it's been great having you here, Kerry. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody. It's been fun. Have fun writing your nightmares.
Brilliant stuff. Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys. We hope to see you in the rest of the Horror Writers Fest and obviously at Samantha Scull's
Definitely go
session
see Sam.
tomorrow as well.
I've seen it. It's great.
Brilliant stuff. Awesome. All right. Thank you, guys. And we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.